it's such an interesting take on. Normally we see conspiracy films where it's like the government, this shadowy organization, knows exactly what it's doing.
Yeah.
And in this, it's like, no, it's everyone bumbling around and they're too powerful to be stopped.
Yeah.
And you look at the news now and you're like, oh my God.
Hi, my name is Kyle Avery. I'm a local artist and educator. And today I have with me Kyle Kleege. Kyle is a writer and director from the Capital District, and he's known for his films Messy Boys and Earworm. And today he's here with me to talk about Brian De Palma's 1981 neo-noir masterpiece, Blowout.
To me, De Palma's Blowout is a film steeped in political corruption and paranoia, but it's also a film that captures the disillusionment going on in post-Watergate America. And just to start off, I was just wondering if you wanted to kind of give us some of the backstory of how De Palma arrived at Blowout.
Well, all right. So Blowout came out 81. So this is post Dress to Kill. So Dress to Kill and Carrie were basically Brian De Palma's only hits. Everything else he had done was either oddly personal or just did not connect with an audience or the box office. And at this point in his career, he's riding high. He made Dress to Kill was a surprise smash. And so suddenly studios are eager to work with him. And he's always the kind of director who, I think once he has a hit, he doesn't really want to ride that fame. He would rather take it and put that money and that attention into something a little more personal. Blowout initially started as a film called Personal Effects. That was the original title. He wanted it to be like a small scale, like $4 to $5 million film with no big stars. John Travolta was eager to work with him. John Travolta's kind of like at the peak of his career at this point, like one of the biggest stars in the world. Travolta sends him a script. It was like some thriller. I think it was about like him being trapped on a plane. And he was like, oh, Brian De Palma could direct that. Sends De Palma the script. And he's like, what are you doing? De Palma's reading the script. He's like, I don't like this. And he's like, well, what are you doing? He's like, I got this small movie, Personal Effects. Send me the script. So Travolta reads it. Suddenly he wants to do it. Suddenly everyone wants to make this movie. So it goes from like a $4 million budget to like a $12 million budget. So, and that's 81. So that's a significant chunk of change for the time. And De Palma also around this time had been trying to gear up adaptation of Prince of the City, which is a true story based on police corruption and a police informant who sent their testimony sent a lot of corrupt cops to jail. And he and the playwright David Rabe had set out, they were doing the script. I think they were trying to get Al Pacino for it. It was something, it was going to be a big deal. He ends up, I think it was with Orion Studios. So they became disillusioned with the script and his approach. Sidney Lumet, the director, becomes interested in Prince of the City. They boot De Palma off of the project. Sidney Lumet swipes it. He essentially steals it from him. So anytime De Palma gets angry and disillusioned by the system or by anything, I feel like he channels that into his next project. So now suddenly he's angry. He's been like screwed over by the system. Dress to Kill hits. He's written this like deeply personal and dark film. And it's like, all right, I had a hit, but I really wanted to make this movie. So no one's going to tell me what to do. So you get that brutal ending. Everyone was begging him to change it. I was like, no, this is where I'm at. So basically, De Palma's coming into this film angry, disillusioned, despite having a hit. He's just going to take all of that and throw it into this movie. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess since we've covered a little bit of De Palma's work, you mentioned Dress to Kill was the year before, so that was 1980. Before we get into the story, I'm just curious, like, where does Blowout sort of rank for you? And before you answer that, I wanted to kind of mention that De Palma is such an interesting filmmaker to me because, to me, I view him as the kind of director who has two careers. He has the commercial career where the average person knows him for Scarface or Mission Impossible, the original with Tom Cruise, right? And then The Untouchables, I think of with De Niro. But then, to me, I'm much more interested in what I refer to as like his cult classics, like his lesser-known films that seem like this interest in the mechanics of cinema. So things like Body Double or Blowout, Dress to Kill, Sisters from 1972.
Femme Fatale.
Femme Fatale. Wow, what a great... Yeah, and you let me borrow that DVD.
Yes, that's a great movie.
Yeah.
For me, Blowout's always the movie that I will throw out as whenever people are like, what's your favorite movie? That's the one I kind of have on standby just to be like, I really like it. I watch it a lot.
Yeah.
I'll just throw that out there. I don't know if I would call it his best overall. I feel like Carlito's Way might be his closest to just a solid cinematic movie, but that one leans more commercial.
Right.
But I think Blowout is one of his most deeply personal, deeply affecting movies. And I think this and Casualties of War kind of stand in this very, very specific spot in his career where you can just feel that anger and that cynicism and disillusion just permeating off the screen.
Yes, I completely agree.
And I feel like you look at the first Mission Impossible, you look at a lot of his commercial things, they're all really well done, and there's a lot of good ideas, and they're better off for having him involved, for sure. But I don't really go back to them as much as I would a Body Double or a Blowout. I mean, I don't really go back to Casualties of War a lot, but that's because it's such a heavy movie. But Blowout is that kind of nice, like, in-between of it's almost commercial. It's got that craft. It's got just the sense of life and just quality to it that you don't get in a lot of like cult films.
Sure.
Because there's big studio money behind it.
Right.
But that's all being funneled into something personal and interesting.
And like you said, it was originally intended to be a smaller picture, but now it has one of the largest stars in the world attached to it. And De Palma also decides to use his wife as the female lead, Nancy Allen, who plays Sally. So I guess let's start off with just a brief synopsis, and then we can go from there. The film follows Jack Terry, played by John Travolta. And Jack is a sound technician who records what appears to be the assassination of a prominent political figure. And then Jack, as the sound technician, starts to sort of spiral into this web of cover-up and conspiracy. And he's trying to figure out what's going on with this death of a political figure who goes by McRyan in the film.
Yes. And I think it should be noted that not only is he a sound technician, he's a sound man for like B movies, for like schlocky horror films. And so his job is essentially to go out and get sound effects for movies. And these are not good movies. And these are usually the kinds of movies that at the time critics would essentially decry De Palma for making. They're like, oh, you make schlock, you make B movies, you make this and that. And I was like, you can tell he's not having that.
The movie starts out with Jack in the studio. The movie opens with a scream, and we start to realize that it's a fake scream, right? Because the movie opens with this sort of first-person point of view, and we see this sort of creeping character outside of this dorm room with these girls. And then we start to realize that Jack is actually in a booth with what we think is the director, I believe.
Yes.
And what's interesting about this is there's this exchange between who is Jack's boss and Jack, where the boss is just so sick of the scream and the sounds, and he kind of scolds him.
I need new wind.
He needs new wind. He tells him to go out and record sounds.
You know what I can't figure out? I can't figure out what a smart guy like you is still doing that shit for.
Oh, come on. You do this shit. I do the sound.
Oh, no, you do the shit.
Oh, is that
Yeah,
right?
like that wind in the trees. It sounds like you're whistling in the crap.
That's the library stuff. We used it a million times.
That is the trouble. I have heard it a million times. Now get something new.
New wind.
Yeah.
Got it.
And I think this plays into a real story of how De Palma kind of arrived at this idea of Blowout, right?
Yes.
So do you want to talk a little bit about the true story that inspired it?
So there are a couple of things that informed Blowout, but when he was doing post-production on Dress to Kill, he had used the same sound effects guy for the last few movies, and they're in the booth, and De Palma's like, I've heard that wind before. I've heard that sound effect. Like, you keep using the stuff from the sound library. And it got into a whole argument, and De Palma's like, can you just get new wind? And it's like, who's going to notice the wind? He's like, I will hear it because I have to live with this movie.
Yeah.
So they're arguing back and forth, and that kind of informed, like, the whole concept of, I'm going to make this sound guy go out, get me a new effect. And then that kind of led into, well, what if he goes out and he records an assassination or a murder, and you get that Hitchcockian thing?
Yes.
Which just kind of builds out from there.
Jesus Christ.
Phantom of the Paradise, and they were doing the sound edit on that film, because you had to obviously physically cut together the film. They would have to do these things called lead in the edit, where in order to create space on something, you would have to put like film stock that might not be yours, just in there to create space. This is, I'm sure other people could tell you more details on lead, but he said he was going through the film, like the reel, and he's looking at the lead, and he realized the film stock that they were using was from Lawrence of Arabia. What was happening was, when they would send back reels from film after their time was done in theaters, they'd send it back to the studio studio would just hack it apart, and they would just like toss it out. So people are like, I'm taking snippets of like this classic film, snippets of that classic film. There's no sound or anything. It's just there to kind of like stretch out the beginning of the film reel just for the sake of an edit or some such thing. And he's looking at this brilliant work, just all of this like suffering, this blood, sweat, and tears that goes into making a film and like making something truly special, and it's reduced to being a lead on a film. He's like, in my film, it's like, this is Phantom of the Paradise. This isn't even close to Lawrence of Arabia. Why have we reduced this like special thing or this intense thing to just this, like, why is it for me? Why is it this? And I think that informs particularly the ending of the film.
Yes.
And that's where he said that came from. And we'll get into the ending a bit later. But do you have any thoughts on that?
The opening sequence of the film, I think, is so interesting because, to me, I think he's being self-referential. I think he's sort of being hard on himself, and maybe he views himself as a guy who makes B horror, which I don't think he is that guy.
He does.
But I wonder, though, do you feel like maybe he sees himself that way, or do you think that maybe he's using that opening sequence of Jack's film that, maybe he's critiquing himself or being self-referential there?
Well, I know De Palma has gone on record kind of shredding and lambasting a lot of slasher films. He does not like Argento or Giallo. He's gone on record saying a couple things about like Giallo in general that he's just was like, it's not interesting. It's just he doesn't like that. He definitely doesn't like slasher. And around this time in the 80s, this is when we're getting like the slasher boom. We're getting, fun fact, every single poster in the film studio that he works for is a real slasher film. It's a real horror film that existed at that time. Right. And these are all like B-list, C-list movies. Like we're looking at Squirm, Boogeyman, all this stuff. So he's referencing this and he's putting it in the world of these films. But I think De Palma's always been trying to elevate the genre stylistically closer. I think he views himself closer to Hitchcock than he would in Argento. Right. And in this moment, I think he's more or less taking what the critics have said about him up to this point, where it's like, oh, he's a hack. Oh, he makes all these like this dreck. Like Carrie's the only one that worked. Even when Dressed to Kill came out, and it was a big hit. Right. It was not critically praised outside of like Pauline Kael was like, this movie's great. Everyone's like, he's a hack. He's just doing this and that, ripping off Hitchcock. And in this moment, I think he's using the intro to the film to not only create a false sense of trashiness, but to also kind of give a middle finger to the critics. Yeah. Because it's like, we're going to go in, we're going to get Garrett Brown, who is the Steadicam inventor and was the Steadicam operator on The Shining. Garrett Brown's coming off of The Shining after like 2 years of shooting on a Steadicam. He's perfected his craft. His next movie after that is Blowout. First thing he has to do is this co-ed frenzy sequence. That's the name of the movie. And he says, first thing De Palma says to him, do not make it good. Do not make any of this good. I want this to look like a trashy film. And it feels authentic to this style of filmmaking, to this style of just cheapo, just C-movie. Sure. But when you start a film, you create this sense of a world. And I think an audience going into this movie blind is going to be taken aback. You're like, what is this movie? What is happening? And you suddenly manipulate them. You're lying to them. De Palma has a phrase. He apes the Godard phrase, because Godard used to say, the camera tells the truth at 24 frames per second. De Palma says the opposite. He's like, it lies at 24 frames per second. He's like, it's all manipulation. And so we start this movie with a false reality. Yeah. We're assuming like, this is the movie from the guy who did Dressed to Kill. Like, what is going on here? Yeah. And then that scream happens, and then we just cut out to John Travolta. Yeah. Everything shifts. Suddenly, we're kind of caught off guard. Like, whoa, what happened? Yes. We realize we've been watching a movie. We've been manipulated. We've essentially been lied to. Yeah. So we're now seeing the process of manipulation. Yes. That sets the tone. Yes. So not only is he using what the critics have said against him, against them, he's also showing his hand at how he can lie to you, how he can manipulate you.
Right, and I think it goes back to that idea of the mechanics of cinema. This is a guy who's very interested in mashing up audio and visual together, right? But he uses it in such a way where he does distort reality and he does throw the viewer off. And I remember that almost unsettling feeling where, like you described early on in the film, I just was, really kind of taken aback about how it transitions from the slasher film with the college girls to Jackson, this booth with the director, and they're just listening to these awful screams of these actresses. Not good screams, right? They're they're terrible. They're comically funny. So I just find that to be so interesting. And then he goes out he's sort of scolded by his boss, and then he goes out into the field at night, right? Not the field, but the actual,
They do, he leaves, and then it cuts to the opening credits sequence, which is a really interesting use of split screen. Yeah. And De Palma's usually known for split screen, and in this movie, he only uses it in two particular sequences. It's this scene where it's establishing what he does while also showing the television, which is establishing the McRyan character, the senator character, the politician.
Yep.
And split screen does an interesting thing too, because it's also manipulative.
Mm-hmm.
It's forcing you to pick and choose your narrative.
Right.
It's like, okay, what's he doing over there? But then if I look over here, I'm missing something here. If I look over there, I'm missing something over here. And you can easily lose track of the McRyan narrative because you're interested in like, oh, the mechanics of filmmaking. That's how they do that.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, but he's still messing with you. He's still controlling you and controlling how you see this.
Right.
He's a truthful liar.
Yes.
He's telling you that he's lying to you. And that's a discomforting thing because now you're kind of forced to reckon with the manipulation and how media is manipulated.
Yeah, it seems like he's constantly blurring the lines between reality and construct, right? And I think that's so interesting. So when I rewatched it last night in preparation, something I didn't notice is early on there's Jack, I believe, is in the studio and the TV's on, and it's a couple news anchors, and they're referencing how if the election ended today, that McRyan would likely win. I believe they said 60% victory, right? And that the current sitting president, his numbers are not very good, and that it's looking bad for him, right? But it's looking very good for McRyan.
For sure.
Jack goes out and records these sounds, and I really want to just touch on the opening one of the earlier sequences of him recording all these sounds, because to me this is like this just beautiful aha moment. Like I'll never forget watching this the first time and just being blown away by I believe he's on the bridge, he hears some wind. He picks up on a couple who might be out on a date, and he hears their conversation back and forth, that the couple sort of see him on the bridge and they're unsettled by his presence, especially the woman. He hears a frog, right? And then
there's the owl, then you hear
oh, that's right, the owl. Yeah, I love the owl too. All these sort of animal noises, right? And the shots of how the animals are in the foreground and Jack is way in the background. And I really love the way that De Palma does this with the camera to sort of show us the depth of field there.
That sequence is so tricky with how difficult those shots must have been.
Yeah.
Because he's using split diopter. It's a night shoot. You're dealing with animals, and it's like, it almost feels like they're superimposed, but it's like, this has to be practical. And just the way it's just images meshed together and overlapped. And every single sound leads to the next sound. He's kind of almost going 360. It's like wind, and then we cut to the point of view of the boom mic moving.
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh, then we're hearing the frog, and it just keeps moving, and we're just scanning it. And then we get the owl, and then we start hearing this weird like, and we don't know what that is, and we're like, is that like insect? What is that? He's not telling you, but he's spelling everything out. He's establishing so many little things that are going to be important.
Right.
And we finally get to the owl. It flies off as we see a car racing down. And then you're kind of, for this part of the movie, it's such you don't really see it that often anymore, the style of filmmaking where you take this relaxed and measured pace to just establish everything. Let's take our time. Let's do this. You don't really know what the movie's up to. If you're going in blind, it's like, what is this movie about? I've already been lied to, and now he's just recording sounds. And then things kick off into high gear. When this car comes barreling through, we hear some strange sounds. The tire blows out. Goes off into the water, and suddenly we're in an actual suspense and action sequence.
Right, yeah. So as the car goes into the water, I mean, Jack is just stunned at what's going on, right? And then what's so interesting to me is another thing I didn't quite think about the first time I'd watched the film, but on a second viewing is I realized that he's like this lone hero, and he just jumps in action, right?
Yes.
The car hits the water, he just immediately puts his gear down, he just dives in. And I think there was a really great story that I saw where Noah Baumbach interviews Brian De Palma, and I believe this was on the Criterion disc of Blowout, right? And he was talking about how nervous Nancy Allen was, who was his wife at the time, and how she was panicky going into
claustrophobic.
this. Right, that's it, yeah.
And, well, what they had to do in order to do the underwater sequence is they had to build a tube for her to get into the car. And, I mean, this would have been a very small tube, clear, so they could shoot through it. So as they fill it with water, she's obviously not going to drown. So they have this whole thing set up. But she had to get into a car underwater in a small tube being claustrophobic.
Right.
That's a horrifying idea. And they had like a team of divers down there and everything. And it's still like, she's an absolute trooper for just doing it. And
I think about from De Palma's point of view, because on one hand, right, this is his career and his life. This is his art. This is the thing that he loves to do. But this is also blurring the lines also, which kind of plays into the larger narrative of the film, is that his wife is in the picture, right? And that she's underwater. And I believe it was it on a soundstage or it was in a studio?
This had to have been on a studio.
It was a controlled,
like this was a controlled environment.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think they were throwing it in whatever the like Delaware River or whatever runs through Philly.
Yeah.
So this would have been a controlled environment, but even so, apparently, a nice little factoid that they only told De Palma after the fact was apparently the car that they had set up down there, everything had collapsed. So like everything just like folded in.
Yeah.
No one told them until after they got the shot. And they're like, yeah, by the way, like we got it, but this happened earlier. And he's like, I put my wife in that?
Yeah.
And you didn't tell me? So I think words were probably shared in that moment. But just the fact that this movie, again, it was originally called Personal Effects. And it probably was supposed to be more of a family affair. I don't know if he wanted Nancy Allen in it originally, because I think at the time, like the critics and what have you were kind of getting on both his and Nancy Allen's cases, being like, well, she's only in movies because Brian De Palma puts her in stuff, even though that's not the case. She's in a bunch of other things, and she's great in those too. Like she's in one of the better sections of 1941. I Want to Hold Your Hand is a great movie. Like she had done so many good things before that, but I think it was starting to kind of get to them of like, John Travolta was really the one pushing for Nancy Allen to be in the film.
Interesting.
He was like, I loved working with her on Carrie. I would love to work with her again. And she was like already on the upswing. Dressed to Kill's a big hit. And she's riding high. So the studio was like, of course we'll use her.
Yeah.
And they're probably both like, I mean, are we going to get hit with that again?
Right.
But I think it works out. I think she's terrific in the film, too.
I think she is, too. Yeah.
Her performance in particular, I think gets a little too much flack. When it was like, well, I think they single out her performance for being a little too, I don't know, like the right word to use, but just kind of airheaded or just something. And it's like, no, she's playing a character. She feels real to this world, and she feels like someone who has struggled her whole life, and she's just trying to do her best. And I think she sells it. I love the voice she uses in it. Like that kind of squeaky voice just makes it for me.
She does have this sort of airy, bubbly voice, which plays into her character. I did want to just kind of go back to the scene where McRyan's car goes into the water. So Jack jumps into action. He dives into the water. There's a quick shot of McRyan's body, right? We now know he's likely dead. I believe there's some blood. And then Jack pulls Nancy out of the car, or Sally, sorry.
Yes.
So Nancy Allen playing Sally. But he pulls her out of the car, and then they go to the hospital, right? And something that really stands out to me is that line delivery with the police officer talking to Jack. and they're at the hospital, and the police officer says something to Jack, this sort of side comment about that guy was going to be our next president, or likely to be our next president. And that's sort of also setting this stage, right? It goes back to the TV clip earlier on where it sounds like McRyan's going to be the next president of the United States. And then we're also notified that, likely to be the next president by this police officer so it's all these little tidbits that are building the story, right?
Which you also could have missed if you were paying attention to one side of the screen.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So what I think is interesting is Jack starts to go down this path of conspiracy and cover-up, right? And he's not quite there yet. He thinks he's going to do the right thing. Yeah. And I think this is such an interesting part of the movie because, once again, the first time I watched it, it just made sense. Well, of course he's going to investigate, right? But upon further viewing, I realized that he is kind of taking on this lone hero where maybe he thinks it's up to him to figure out this murder and who's behind this political assassination. And so do you want to talk about where we kind of go from the hospital and how he starts to revisit the original sound recording?
Well, I just want to jump in a little more on the lone hero thing, because I think they do an interesting thing with John Travolta.
Yeah, please do.
Because John Travolta's the biggest star in the world at this point.
Yep.
And you're going to expect him to be the hero. You're going to expect him to do all of these things. And I think the way they shoot him in a lot of early scenes, they're showing you that, yes, he's doing the right thing. Yes, he's one man against the system. And then the way they frame a lot of the Jack Sally sequences feels almost like they're shooting it like a typical romance film. Like they're kind of hinting at all of these things. But as it goes on and as the obsession grows more and more, you start to realize it's not heroics, it's obsession, and things are not working out the way we think they are. Yeah. And it's deconstructing itself the entire time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a great place to jump in. I was actually just going to mention this idea of, within Blowout, there's this idea of political paranoia and the myth of the lone hero, right? And I think Jack he's a capable guy. He seems like he can try to figure this out, right? Because he's very good with the sound equipment. He's making these kind of B movies. He wants to do the right thing. But I think De Palma is using Jack as this sort of American everyman hero to fight back against this political system, right? But I think what's interesting is I think De Palma's subverting the trope that he can be the everyman hero. And I think he does this by showing us and emphasizing that Jack, there's a helplessness to him, that he keeps trying to do the right thing, but yet he's sort of failing, right?
Well, he's trying to do the right thing, and in a perfect world, he would have succeeded.
Right.
But you're going up against the system.
Right.
And you can't beat the system when it won't allow anything to knock it off course. Everything in this movie, what I love about this film in particular is how the entire scenario is a complete mess. And like even the scheme behind it all is a failure.
Yes.
Like everything is a failure.
Yes.
And like there's Jack trying to do his damnedest to do the right thing. And even if he succeeded in getting the tape shown or anything, I don't think anyone would have believed him.
Right. And that's what I think is so interesting is that paranoia. I think as the film starts to go on, Jack becomes increasingly isolated, right? He starts to sound like a crazy person as the film goes on, right? And just to kind of, touch on these briefly, and then we can go into them deeper if you'd like to. For example, law enforcement, he goes to the police, right? And law enforcement, they seem indifferent about this information about McRyan and the blowout.
They just want it to be done.
They just want it to be done, right? And even early on in the hospital scene, I think about Jack trying to tell the police that there was a girl in the car, and the police are instantly sort of resistant to this idea about going along with the truth because they say something about, well, do you want McRyan's wife to find out that there was a girl in the car and that he was maybe having an affair or something?
Yeah, like that. Right? The one guy shows up who is one of McRyan's like political, I don't know if he's a campaign manager or something, but he's clearly a major political figure. Shows up to the hospital. The cops are immediately dismissive Jack. And what he's saying, there's so much attitude. They're giving him so much grief over his testimony because they don't want it to be this way, because public opinion for a politician lying and doing unsavory things, even though his platform is great, it's like, oh, well, we can't have that because it's like we're trying to pass these bills. There's so much more important than just the man himself. So Travolta is basically being coerced into doing the right thing. Like, isn't it better if his wife knows that he died alone? That's how they guilt him. They're like, his wife and kids, you really want them to know that? And I was like, well, it happened.
Yeah,
like that's the truth.
Yeah, and in that line, I think there's a part where they mention, like, do you want his wife and kid to hear this on the news or read about it? So De Palma's referencing using media, and that's actually the next thing I was going to mention is as Jack becomes increasingly isolated, so law enforcement seem indifferent to this news. Secondly, the media, right? He goes to this reporter by Donahue, I believe is the character's name.
Phil Donahue.
Phil Donahue. And so he goes to Phil Donahue.
I think it's Phil. That's Donahue. We'll call him Donahue.
But they seem skeptical as well, right?
Well, it's Frank Donahue.
Yes.
Frank Donahue.
Yes.
Frank seems eager, but I've always been kind of unsettled by that character.
Right.
Because how does he, like, who's his source? How does he know this? Like,
right.
He just it kind of is immediately clued into stuff. And it's like, if you know this, someone else knows this. Who's telling you this? Why isn't this news? You're just chasing this down because this is something you can show an audience. It's easier to grasp. And I was like, yeah, there's your evidence. Cool. But I've always just been like, how do you know? It's like, is it plot convenience or is it just everyone is constantly being observed?
Right. Yeah, because there's this feeling of surveillance throughout the film, right?
Yes.
We're either seeing the characters watching other characters, or there's oftentimes throughout the film where we don't actually know who's surveilling who.
It's just very voyeuristic angles. There's quite a few in particular where they used when he's the creepiest shot in the movie for me is when Travolta is he's hiding the film in his in his ceiling of his own house, and it's shot from outside through a window. The music is tense and it's slowly zooming in on him, and it's a wide angle shot. And it's like, who's watching?
Yes.
And I was like, I don't think anyone's watching. It's just the camera.
Yeah.
And that's a horrifying notion of it's just no matter what, even if there's no one watching, you're still being observed.
Right. There's a few scenes throughout the film, right, where I believe one is taken from the outside of a building that Jack's in, and it seems like he's on the top floor of the building.
That's the shot I'm talking about.
And it's zooming in, but there's another one where you can see him start to relax. I don't know if he has like a cocktail or a mixed drink, but he has some kind of drink in his hand, and he goes to sort of lay onto the couch or spill onto the couch, and there's this sort of zoom shot of this top-down view of him, and I feel like every time one of these happens in the film, it just reinforces this feeling of distrust and paranoia, and it is unsettling. Can I go back to, I wanted to just touch on this idea of Jack being this kind of everyman hero, and I wanted to get your thoughts. So Jack is technically skilled and he's morally driven, but he's powerless against these kind of opaque hidden forces that we don't really know who they are, right? Like De Palma doesn't clue us into, what government agency do these people work for? What's their title, right? They're purposely left opaque, which I think is really, really interesting. And I just feel like as he's showing us all this stuff, he's debunking this idea that, if truth is uncovered, that it will lead to justice, right? But we actually find out that this isn't true, And I feel like this idea of subverting the truth and this manipulation of reality, and I find it to be so interesting that as the film goes on, Jack's inability to stop the conspiracy reinforces or underlines this idea that they are in a cynical world, right? And that he wasn't able to save Nancy Allen's character, Sally. And I think this just goes back to this idea that they're in this cynical world and this reality is recycled into spectacle, And I think it goes back to the opening scream, the closing scream, this idea of media and how things are recycled. And I don't know, I was just curious about your thoughts on Jack sort of being this everyman American hero. He thinks he's going to overcome these monolithic government forces that are at play. And I was just curious to hear your thoughts on Jack versus this force.
I view Jack as he's a cynic. He's an idealist who's been made a cynic, obviously, through several circumstances. And clearly, just based on his backstory and like the things he was doing before he was a sound man, kind of inform like the type of idealist he has been. But he's an idealist who's been used by systems. And he is, in fact, traumatized. And he keeps going back to a specific trauma, which they have, like the hanging feet is an image that they keep going back to throughout the movie, and that's a source of trauma for him. And he's someone who keeps going back to this and keeps failing, and he keeps recreating the scenario because he still can't get over this trauma. And it's just easier to take advantage of that. It's easier to discredit someone like that. And it's also, Brian De Palma is an incredibly cynical guy. He just, if you ever listen to him in interviews talking just American foreign policy and just politics in general, like he came up during Vietnam, he came up during Watergate. Like he's someone who's like, yeah, the system is not your friend. These politicians are not your friend. And when he first started out, his earlier films are way more politically radical, like kind of like they're not thrillers, they're more like Godardian, like experimental revolutionary films, like espousing these ideas. And he said he noticed, I think when he was promoting Hi Mom, he was brought on to all of these TV shows, and he kept getting paraded around as like a political radical, and they're like, yes, in this movie and that, and they were essentially using him on these platforms to platform their own ideas and turn he was like, they took the revolution and they commodified it. They put it out there, and suddenly I was part of this system using, like, I was espousing all these ideals on commercial television. And like, isn't that interesting? We'll be right back after these commercials. Yeah. And he's like, you can't win. Like, how do you even create like political upheaval? How does revolution happen in a society that is just so ingrained and it's capitalistic and just status quo ideals? Right. And I think Jack's coming from that too, where it's you can't break through. How do you break through? And he's trying, and it just keeps making things worse. And it's like, do you even try after a certain point? And I don't think De Palma's saying give up, but I think he's at least pointing to the fact of this is how messed up and corrupt our system is. This is how they use it against you. Like if he were to get the tape onto TV, if he were to say like, this is McRyan's assassination footage, and he even says it in the movie, people will point out at it and be like, well, he's a film sound guy, he has access to all this stuff. Of course he made it in the editing room. And so there's never going to be any beliefs. He pointed out during the Kennedy assassination how there were all of these eyewitness testimonies, there were all these things, and it just kept getting bigger and leading to this and leading to that. And it's to the point where it's so big, no one's going to believe anybody. So now you've got this section over here believing there was a second gunman. There's a section over here believing Oswald acted alone. And then it's like, all right, you look at that and you're like, I don't know what to believe. And you have to like pick and choose, and there's all of the stuff. And even if he gets the truth out, it's not going to matter, because everyone's going to be like, someone will be like, that's fake. And it becomes an argument. No justice will be served. These, like John Lithgow, may be the one who gets defeated, but the guys who, like, he's just the gun.
Yeah, right.
The gunmen are going to get away.
Right.
And I don't know how you can defeat that.
Yeah, yeah.
And you can try your damnedest, but you're only going to do so much. And the fact that he keeps, through his trauma and through this essentially a charade of heroics, which are incredibly misguided. Like, I keep looking at the ending of this film and being like, why are you putting a wire on Nancy Allen? Why don't you just go to the television studio?
Yeah.
Now there's so many things, but he can't do that.
Right.
He has to, it all harkens back to his backstory in the King Commission, which
Yeah.
I don't think we've gotten to yet.
Yeah.
But
let's go ahead and touch on that then.
Let's touch
Yeah,
on
yeah,
that
yeah.
because with Travolta, with Jack's backstory, he was originally in the military for communication and surveillance, and he ends up taking that, and he gets hired by a group of politicians called the King's Commission, who their entire purpose is, we want to weed out police corruption. Ironic, considering what the politicians in this movie are up to. And they do a whole backstory on a police informant, a police officer. I think his name is Freddie Corso. Travolta's job is to wire him. He's putting a microphone on him. They're going to record a conversation between a politician and a mob boss and Freddie. And it's a great sequence, which clearly was taken from what De Palma wanted to do on Prince of the City.
Yeah.
And another film about police corruption. And in this sequence, Freddie starts to sweat, and it causes the battery to arc, and it starts burning Freddie while he's in a car with these two very dangerous and very powerful individuals. And he's nervous, and it keeps making it worse. And Travolta's freaking out because it starts interfering with the audio.
Yeah.
And he knows what's going on, but there's no way he can help him. And they end up, like, Freddie gets out, goes into a bathroom in, like, a really sketchy, like, store. And Travolta's, like, trying to get in there to help this guy and be like, I gotta get in there. And it's like, you're gonna blow his cover, just let it be. Mob guy goes in. We're not hearing anything through the wire. And Travolta rushes in after the mob guy leaves, and he finds Freddie dead, hanging from the microphone wire. And it's a great visual, and it just tracks down along, like, the wire down across Freddie and then down to his feet dangling. And we keep going back to that image of dangling feet.
Yes.
And Travolta's clearly traumatized, clearly guilt-ridden because of this. And he keeps going back to this thing of, like, if I can only fix that situation. And in the end, he puts Nancy Allen in the same exact thing.
Yeah.
And it's in a normal film, that wouldn't happen.
Right.
He would not put her in that situation, but he's not a hero.
Right.
He's a traumatized individual who has been traumatized by this power structure, by this corrupt power structure. And he can't move past it. So you can tell his thinking is, if I can get through this, if I can use Nancy Allen, if I can use Sally to get this information against this guy, maybe I can move on.
Right. Yeah.
And of course, it doesn't happen.
Right.
And it happens, and it goes bad because he did that.
Right.
And it's this endless cycle that just keeps repeating.
Right. And that's why I mentioned earlier that I think, like, at the end, you know, her scream is recycled as spectacle. Jack, it's his inability to stop the conspiracy. It's his inability to save Sally's life, right? I wanted to mention during this flashback, did you catch what Jack references himself as, the name he gives himself?
Well, I hear there's Whiz Kid.
Whiz Kid.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting because it's this thing that sort of traumatized him that's in the back of his mind, yet he refers to himself as the Whiz Kid, right? And I think about in our own lives, you know, our own personal failures, you know, do we refer to ourselves as, you know, praising ourselves in that sort of sense, while in the same breath also referencing our own personal failure, you know?
Well, I think he's being disparaging there because
interesting. Okay.
He's talking to Nancy Allen in the they're at the train station after she's like, the politicians are like, you need to get out of town, here's some money, disappear for a while.
Yeah.
But when he's talking to her about it, and she's like, oh, you make movies, and he's like, yeah, I'll talk about that. And he's asking her, it's like kind of a cute scene. Even though the top shot of that is shot at such an odd wide angle that we're not involved in the conversation, we're just observing it, which is, that's just a stray observation of how the movie creates a discomforting sense.
Surveillance again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then it moves in close. And but those angles too are like just kind of slightly off. Like Travolta's a little like oddly angled in the shot, where Nancy's coverage, and then he's kind of on his own. But there's just always these weird little interruptions. Like, it doesn't feel quite right. But as he's talking to her, he brings up like being in the military, then joining the police, and she's like, you were a cop? And he's like, no, I was in the King Commission. It was like a thing. And then he starts going back to movies. He's clearly, like, you can see the trauma on his face. He's like, I don't want to talk about that. I do not want to get into that. And then she keeps pushing. She's like, no, that's like real stuff. And like, there's all of this cute music playing. It's like a meet cute.
Yeah.
And he starts talking about what he did and doing, like, I had to wire this guy. Cute music, meet cute. Drops in to a shot of the wire, and it starts pulling up and back into this, like, great, like, kind of just slightly top shot.
Yeah.
The Pino Donaggio score kicks in.
Yes.
We're hearing the source music of, like, oh, it's cute, blah, blah, blah. Suspense music hits. Immediately the mood shifts. And as he's talking, and he's referencing all of these things, when he brings up WizKid, it's when he's talking about the battery arcing, and we're hearing it, and the music really starts to pick up. And he's like, the one thing the WizKid didn't think about, he's clearly like, he's like, I messed up. Yeah. I'm an idiot. I was supposed to be smart. I was supposed to be great.
Yeah.
And like, he's talking about early on, like, winning science fair awards when he was a kid. He's like, I used to build computers, which is actually a thing De Palma did before he got into film. Like, when he was a kid, he was a computer geek. Like, he would build home computers and stuff. So there's a lot of De Palma backstory. I think it's this moment of he, in these little inflections, these little moments and nuances, you can get this sense that Jack has zero confidence in himself and his abilities. He has resigned himself to being a B-movie sound guy, even though we see him do all of these incredible things. He could clearly do better, but he's retreated into this world of spectacle and schlock. Yeah. Because it pays the bills, I guess.
Yeah, and so you mentioned the meet cute, which I think is interesting because Hitchcock, right? We've covered Hitchcock on this podcast.
Yes.
And De Palma's, I would say, his favorite filmmaker is Hitchcock, unless you want to correct me on that.
I think I don't know if I would say it's his favorite.
Okay.
I know everyone watching this will be like, of course, he steals from him all the time.
Yeah.
I think Godard was always his favorite.
Okay.
Just looking back at his earlier films. But I think he realized that style of filmmaking was not, it wasn't as appealing, and it wasn't as appealing to him.
Sure.
Because it was a little more restrictive. And I think he took Hitchcock, who to him I think is one of his all-time favorites. But De Palma, coming from a background, like a mechanical background, like I build computers,
right?
I build things. There's no more mechanical filmmaker than Hitchcock.
Yeah.
You look at his movies, you know how you can make a movie. And De Palma, I think, looked at it and was like, if I take that, if I do that, and if I do that, then I can figure this out.
Right.
And it's not really a crutch, because I feel like he takes things that Hitchcock did and he expands on them in different ways. And he's also referencing the fact that he's taking this.
Right.
he's always telling you what he's doing. Where Hitchcock would try and like sweep you up in the moment of like suspension of disbelief, where De Palma's going to be like, I'm lying to you.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I was thinking last night as I was rewatching it, I was thinking about specifically the meet cute, that that's a thing that Hitchcock does, right?
Yes.
Is he sort of subverts the meet cute. When I saw The Birds Here a couple weeks ago, I was thinking about how Rod Taylor and Tippi Hedren get off on the wrong foot.
Yes.
And this happens also in Rear Window. There's a disconnect between Grace Kelly and Jimmy Stewart, right? And it doesn't quite have that traditional meet cute feeling.
Yeah.
And I feel like this is something that De Palma's picking up on, that he's referencing in a movie like Blowout, right? Like, we're watching Jack uncover the conspiracy, and he's starting to realize that there's a cover-up going on, but also there's these really tender moments between him and Sally where there is sort of this meet cute, and they're almost kind of on a date, but it's also sort of dangerous.
There's a romantic energy.
There is a romantic energy, yeah.
In the way it's shot, and the way they're doing the music, and the way Travolta and Nancy Allen interact with each other.
Right.
The way they're performing it. But what are they saying?
Yeah, and that's what
they always go back to the conspiracy.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that's bringing them together. And it feels like they're going the romantic angle when you first watch the movie.
Right.
It feels like it's that. But the more I've rewatched this movie, the more just upsetting it is, because Nancy Allen is just getting dragged into the situation, and Travolta is so traumatized and so messed up that he's dragging her into this with him, because the way they interact, he's very sweet at times, but then he gets very short with her. He gets very intense. He gets very obsessive over like the conspiracy, the accident. She's just trying to help him out because she seems to like him and like interacting with him, because he seems like he's pretty much the only guy in the movie that is halfway decent to her.
Yeah.
And then it's just taking a second to step back from that, to step back from the artifice of the meet cute, of the way they're doing these sequences. He's just using her as well.
Yes, and upon further viewing of this film, it's something I didn't quite pick up on the first two times, of how much he's sort of strong arming her into going along with this and investigating this conspiracy. And I think that that's something that I find to be so interesting is, the first two viewings, okay, she kind of goes along with it, but last night when I revisited it, I realized, wow, he's really kind of like putting the heat to her. No, he's not very nice.
Nice to her at all.
Right. And, he kind of pulls her into this redemption arc, right? Or what he thinks it's going to be.
He thinks it's his redemption arc.
Yeah.
When I was like, just go see a Broadway show with her.
Right.
Just go.
Right.
And he can't let well enough alone.
Sure.
And again, like her whole backstory of just constantly being like used for divorce photography and being like in this situation.
Sure.
And then this relationship feels on the surface less transactional, because again, you've got John Travolta, a heartthrob, who's like being charming and everything. He's still manipulating her into this situation.
Yeah.
And it's just, I rewatched it last night too, and I almost couldn't get through it this time because of how punishing it was, because you're seeing all of these things and I know where it goes. And it was like, I need to stop.
Yeah.
Like, this is way, way harder and way heavier than I like.
Yeah.
And it just...
Would you agree that, to me, it seems like a film that seems, it's a film that as you revisit it, it becomes sadder and more tragic. And I agree. I it's a film that I love, but as you know where it's going because you've already seen it before, you start to pick up on things you didn't notice in previous viewings. But one of those things is how tragic this film is and how sad it is. And I didn't quite realize that the first couple times.
And it gets, again, it gets worse each time. It gets worse. I remember I worked in a movie theater a few years ago, and after hours, like when it was closed, we would go in and we would just watch movies. I brought Blowout one day, and what ended up happening was no one I was with had seen it before. And we were in the middle of like the big climax. And someone went upstairs and like turned on a bunch of lights and like stopped the movie because they were opening up, even though they didn't know we were in there watching it.
Okay.
And we're all like, they're all yelling like, turn it back on. And they did, and they're like, oh, I'll rewind, like I'll go back and through the scene. And every single person in the room was screaming not to go back because it was so intense. It was so suspenseful. It was like, I can't do that scene again.
Yeah.
I can't do this. And it's the suspense and the tension was already there from the start. And the movie posits itself as, it feels like when you watch it the first time, you're going to get that happy ending. You're going to get that heroic thing. I remember when I first saw it, I was like, wow, man, this is so intense. This is good. And then you see the fireworks sequence and you realize
Unbelievable.
she's not coming back.
Yeah.
Like this, you did this. It took my breath away.
Yeah.
I just kind of had to sit there, and it was like such a visceral, emotional reaction to that fireworks shot.
Yeah.
Of realizing this is what this led to.
Yeah.
This is what this led, and you just kind of sit there in shock for the rest of the movie, and then that final scene happens, and it's just like one final punch.
Yeah.
Like dear God.
I think you're totally right about that. It feels like a sequence of punches almost, like not only is De Palma putting you down by, Jack's inability to solve the conspiracy, his inability to save Sally, that gorgeous spinning fireworks sequence is just beautiful. It's one of the most gorgeous shots I can think of
In film,
hands down. But then after that, shortly after that, we see Jack is crying on a bench, right? And
what's interesting about that scene, though, in particular, is there's snow falling.
Yes.
And everything before that and the scene after that kind of feel like I don't think it almost feels like a continuity error, because it just feels like we're in a different season, and this kind of movie should not take that long to finish.
Yeah.
And I get the sense that it's a shot pulled out of time. And I was like, maybe that's the shot that happens after the final scene. Like that's, and I'm like,
okay.
I don't know. That's how I've always kind of taken it, because I'm like, I don't know. Like the timing just feels off.
Yeah.
And it's like this is just his forever moment. And then we jump back to like the next thing that led him to this.
Right.
And I get the sense that maybe what happened in the edit, that was probably supposed to be the last shot. And the final sequence probably led into that. Yeah. And it didn't quite work. So they probably swapped it. That's just the sense I get. I don't know if that's the case.
Right.
But I think that works for me even more, because it just kind of throws me off again of like, I can't quite.
Well, it's such a that final 10 minutes, the spinning shot of Nancy Allen in Travolta's arms under the fireworks. It's just so stunning. Then we see Jack on a bench, and he's got tears running down his face.
Yeah,
and
but he's also at an obscured angle.
We're behind him, and we see the bridge, and it's snowing. But then after that, it goes, it ends with the studio shot, right, where he's hearing the scream again. Yeah. And her scream has been recycled into spectacle, right?
But it goes from that, so it goes from spinning shot to bench to him in the studio. We're hearing the scream, and it builds up to the scream. Like we're hearing the murder tape, and he's just in the editing room. Tape is still lying around everywhere, so that's why it's like that had to happen before. They probably had to rearrange it because it just hits better. Yeah. And it's so horrifying because it's just a succession of the tape. After that point, there's nothing but that tape. Yeah. Spinning shot, to him listening to her talking to him about we should go see like Sugar Babies on Broadway, all these sweet things, to them him in the editing room as we're hearing like Burke grunting and her struggling, and he's just working away on the flatbed, and then it cuts to the scream.
Yeah. And you see this, just the pain on his face. And it is really, really powerful.
It's incredibly visceral too, because we've seen his trauma manifest like on his face throughout the film.
Yeah.
And he is great in this film because it is a very, very low key and measured performance.
Yeah.
And it's all played through the eyes. It's all played through the face.
Yeah.
And apparently he, throughout the entire shoot, suffered from insomnia. Oh. And it actually, the exhaustion, I think, helps the performance because you just feel so beaten down by everything.
Yeah.
And you get those glimpses of like the hopeful Travolta of like the charm starts to come out in moments.
Yeah.
Mostly with like Nancy Allen when it was like, you're right, that's a very like purposeful charm. He's very clearly just having to switch it on.
Sure.
It doesn't feel effortless in this movie. Like Travolta is charming in anything regardless, but it feels like he's actively trying to like keep his head above water.
Yeah.
And like any other scene, he just like his head's down, his shoulders are like up. He just looks like he's hunched over like an editing bay at all times.
A defeated man.
Yeah. And then finally this comes up and it's like he gets life again.
Yeah.
And it's like the only thing kind of driving his energy. And then in the end, it's even worse.
Right.
Like he's sweating. He just looks awful. His hair's a little more unkempt. He doesn't look the best, and all he can do is cover his ears because they're just, that's a good scream.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked a lot about Travolta's character. We've talked about Nancy Allen in the film, but we haven't really talked much about John Lithgow. And I was wondering if we could kind of pivot and talk about Burke for a second.
Oh, yeah.
So Lithgow plays Burke, and Burke is this sort of shadowy government fixer, and his mission is purposely left, opaque. We don't really know what his mission is. We just know that he's part of this, hidden force that's against Jack.
He's there to get McRyan out of the race.
Yeah.
And he does.
Right.
Which we find out later was not the plan.
Yeah.
They just wanted dirty pictures to like leak to the press.
Right.
And discredit him.
Right.
And he decides, no, it would be better to stop them by shooting out the tire.
Yeah.
But the way he details it, it kind of feels like he was always planning on killing.
Yeah.
And oh my, he is also one of the sloppiest assassins in film history. He's good at killing people, but he's not good at keeping it all together. And it kind of feels like he just keeps screwing up, and he's flying by the seat of his pants, and he just keeps digging himself in further.
Yeah.
He is inept. He's good at like the physical killing part, but he keeps doing things. Like he ends up posing as a serial killer in order to cover up his eventual killing of Nancy Allen. But it kind of feels like that's what you were doing before.
Right, yeah.
Like, he's just clearly not right. He's clearly insane. Again, he's an assassin. He's not right to begin with.
Right.
But when he's on the phone with one of the president's, like, men, they get on a payphone. The guy is clearly like, Burke, do not call me. Like, what the hell did you do?
Yeah.
That's not what we discussed. But that guy stays on the phone because he's now involved in this situation.
He's part of the plot.
And Burke is like, no, I've erased all the sound guys' tapes. I'm going to find the photographer. I am going to kill Nancy Allen and disguise it as a series of sex killings. And there's that great sequence that starts off in the mall where he's just looking out over the escalator of people with a picture of Nancy Allen. We don't know what she's done yet with all the divorce photography.
Sure.
But it's still like, it's visually planting the seed of like, why does he have that photo? Like, what's going on here? And You get the woman who looks like Sally coming down the elevator, dresses up. When I first saw it, I thought it was Nancy Allen. And it was a very tense sequence because you're like, I don't know what's happening.
Right.
And he ends up stalking her through a lot of very interesting locations. There's also an interesting thing they do with the color palette in that sequence where it first starts off with him in I think it's a mall, and it's very brightly lit. It's very like white lighting. It's everything in the shot is very white and bright and light. Then the next scene, they go through a fish market. It's blue. Everything is blue. Like they clearly tinted the film. And then he follows her out by like a construction site outside by a bus stop. Before she can get on a bus, he gets her. They tumble down a hill into pure red lighting.
Right.
Red, white, and blue.
Yeah.
But when he turns her over, I've always found it interesting because I've always gotten the sense that he's shocked. Like he messed up again and it wasn't Nancy Allen.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's quite the case. I think he is actually methodically going through and murdering different women. And he then is looking at her, looking at the body, looks around, and I know you were talking about this before we started recording, and I think we should jump back into this.
Let's do it.
When it's a shot of John Lithgow, it's a full reveal of his face, pure red lighting. He looks over at a billboard, it racks focus onto a Liberty Bell for celebrating Liberty Day in Philadelphia. And he takes out an ice pick, which he stole earlier. And then he starts to stab, and it pulls away. We don't see any blood or anything. Right. And it's just a move, and it's a very, very Fritz Lang style shot where we see the shadow play on the wall, and the camera keeps craning up.
Yeah.
And then we go back from red light into like essentially the depths of hell in this like construction hole.
Yeah.
And it goes up onto like a blue lit street.
Yeah.
And Nancy Allen rounds the corner. And it's like, there she is doing this whole thing. Well, just down there, there's a horrible thing happening that could very easily involve her.
Sure.
And I just get the sense that in that moment, Burke was like, okay, that'll do. That's a good symbol. And he's just like, okay, that's the next thing I got to do.
Yeah.
Later on in the movie, they talk about they show a news story on television while Travolta's waiting for a phone call that's never going to come. He's not paying attention, but we're watching him do other stuff. But on the TV, they're showing, like, they're talking about another killing. And I just noticed this recently. It's not the same woman that was killed in that previous scene. So he's clearly, like, killing multiple people. Right. And he also talks about on the phone, he's like, I'm going to disguise her death as a series of sex killings in the area. And all that politician wants to do is get the kid off the phone.
Right.
I was like, I don't want to be a part of this.
Yeah.
Like, I just wanted him out of the race. And the whole conspiracy is just a series of unfortunate events. It's just fallen apart.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, these guys aren't good at this either. But the machine will allow it to continue.
Yeah.
And, like, these idiots who... It's such an interesting take. Normally we see conspiracy films where it's like the government, this shadowy organization knows exactly what it's doing.
Yeah.
And in this, it's like, no, it's everyone bumbling around and they're too powerful to be stopped.
Yeah.
And you look at the news now and you're like, oh my God, this is a series of idiots who can't be stopped.
Right.
And that's even more disheartening because it's like, wow, you're not good at your job and you're still getting away with it.
Yeah.
And I can't stop you.
Well, I feel like, Burke is such an unnerving character because every time he's on screen, you just get this really bad feeling that something's going to happen because he's either surveilling a character that you're rooting for, or he's just strangling someone, or he's stalking someone. And I feel like it really is. It's an ice cold performance, but I feel like along the lines of what you were just saying about, these kind of hidden government forces and the machine that you referenced, to me, I feel like Burke symbolizes how morality is abandoned when power is at stake. And we know that McRyan is likely to win the election, and Burke is this fixer who has to step in. And I really, as I've revisited Blowout in recent viewings, the parts that I love more and more are the scenes where Burke is meddling.
Yes.
And he's covering up things. He changes the tire. He erases the footage. It's referenced that somehow he accessed the tape at the lab and erased it. He breaks into Jack's studio and erases Jack's stuff, although we don't actually see that.
No,
he's
but
surveilling Jack. It's so unnerving, right?
And then there are all these shots that are seemingly unmotivated, like Jack through the window hiding his thing. And it's like,
Right.
is Burke watching?
Right.
We've already established that he's there. There's another great scene that always unnerves me with Burke when he's calling the police to tell, he's putting on this voice like he's this deranged serial killer. And he's like, I don't know. And he's like, she's in this big hole. And it's John Lithgow doing this really unsettling voice, posing as a deranged sex killer.
Yeah.
And the camera's moving around the phone booth, and we see his face as he's saying this, and his voice is so committed to the emotion of it, but his face is stone cold.
Yeah.
He's just like waiting for like the ample opportunity. He's also watching Travolta, and he's saying all of this stuff, watching him, unmoving face,
Right,
ice
right.
cold, and he hangs up, and then he just goes into the house to do a thing.
Yeah.
And it's just he's such an unnerving character, even though he just keeps making the situation worse.
Yeah.
That makes it even more horrifying.
Yeah. No, he really is. He's unnerving. He's just, like you said, it's like when he's in the phone booth and he's doing the voice, it seems so like comical and kind of funny to me.
But it's almost comical, and then you just really think about it.
Yes.
It's like, no.
Yes.
Like, he is in such control.
Yeah.
And then, like, when he kills the woman in the train station.
Yes.
Which he's there knowing that he's going to meet Nancy Allen.
Yeah.
He doesn't have to kill that woman.
Right.
And he does.
Does anyways,
He
yeah.
does it anyway.
Yeah.
And we, again, like, he gets her in the bathroom with his little piano wire thing. And we go back to that shot of feet dangling in a bathroom stall and another victim of this system.
And it's slowly zooming out, and
We're
see
hearing it starts. We hear the struggle, and as we pull back, the sound it starts to fade out, and the sound mix as we just hear train noises as life is continuing on. It's out of sight, out of mind. Everything is going on as normal.
Yeah, and I was thinking about the sound of that character, the woman who's strangled in the bathroom, and how her heels are banging against that wall, and it just I realized this asynchronous sort of sound that's going on, and how her leg is moving and jolting in such a way that just you feel it. You can actually feel what's happening to her without like truly seeing it in that moment. And the way
we just see the feet. It's a very Hitchcockian moment.
Yeah.
It's incredible because it's more horrifying because of that, and because of the sound design and its loud bangs against metal.
Yeah.
It's a real struggle.
Yeah.
And even in Hitchcock, you wouldn't get that.
Right.
Because he kind of would be like, all right, swell the score here.
Sure.
They remove score.
Sure.
You are just here for that noise.
Yeah.
And now we're hearing the train station announcements as the feet slowly stop moving.
Right.
And you're just kind of, and it's a very long, very slow and methodical pullback.
Right.
You can't look away from these feet. You're locked into the scene.
Oof.
He's not letting you off the hook.
Sure.
And it's, again, I think one of the things that causes critics to really turn against De Palma is he forces you to look at these things. He doesn't harp on it. And that scene is wholly unnecessary.
Right.
And that's the point.
Right.
You're forced to watch an unnecessarily upsetting sequence.
And I think it goes back to this idea of death as spectacle, right? Or he's referencing it in how Jack makes his B horror movies, but this death that's completely unnecessary is really just used just for us, the viewer who's watching the film. It really has nothing to do with the plot. This is just Burke is
doing his thing,
a maniac who's going to unfortunately kill this woman.
Yeah.
So, Kyle, I want to pivot away from Burke for a second, and I want to talk about the fragility of truth and the manipulation of reality in Blowout. Now, there's a lot going on here, right? And I'm going to turn it over to you in a second. But as I was thinking about this film, I was thinking about epistemology, right? Which I know is such a random thing, but I was thinking about senses. And I was kind of putting myself in Jack's shoes for a minute. And I was thinking, how do we know to trust our senses, right? How do we know what we know? And can we trust these senses? And with a movie like Blowout, I can't help but think that De Palma is symbolically answering this question for us by making Jack's character a sound engineer or a sound technician, right? So, we know that he's morally driven. We know that he's technically skilled. And so Jack's profession sort of answers this inquiry for us. Jack works with fragments of reality, right? He's a sound guy. He thinks what he hears is a gunshot. And then later on in the film, we find out that there's this shady photographer played by Dennis Franz who is experimenting with what he claims is a new film for his still film camera.
I do a lot of night shooting.
I do a lot of night shooting, he says, and that kind of, I love how he's got this kind of trashy cop thing going on, you know? He always just plays such a good sort of sleazy character, you know? And so for me, I remember the first time watching this, and there was this just beautiful aha moment when it clicked in my mind, and I realized like that De Palma had unveiled that now we can marry Jack's sound with the photos,
with
right? And so with my fine arts background, I couldn't help but talk about Edward Muybridge and thinking about, it's called The Horse in Motion. It's from June 1878 is when it was created. And what was so groundbreaking about this is I guess there was a little bit of a debate on is there a moment when a horse is galloping at full speed where all four of their legs leave the ground, right? And this sort of sequence of photos that Muybridge took captures this moment where all four legs leave the ground and the horse is sort of suspended in motion. And so I thought this was so interesting because he's working with fragments of reality, but I think the film underlines this kind of postmodern anxiety that, reality is not objective and that it's filtered, it's edited and manipulated. And who's filtering it, editing it, and manipulating it? Our media, our government. And sometimes it's the failure of our own tools, right? By our own hand. But, there's a Brechtian thing going on. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk about this sort of careful balance between reality and construct and maybe how Brecht works into that.
For the Brechtian thing, Bertolt Brecht came up in like the German theater, and a lot of Brecht's ideals about theater and about just media experience in general, his plays would often clue the audience into the fact that what they were watching wasn't real. Normally, you're supposed to suspend the disbelief and be like, I have to fully buy into what's happening on the play. I have to fully experience it on this emotional level. Brecht would pull back and be like, nope, this is what's happening. This is not real. This is not real. You are now actively thinking about why this isn't real. Like you are actively engaged in this way rather than emotionally. You cannot be a passive observer anymore. You suddenly remove the audience's expectation of just existing with a movie. And De Palma came up in the theater when he was in college. He studied under a director named Wilfrid Leach, who taught at, I think it was Columbia University. It was either Columbia or Sarah Lawrence. But he was educating De Palma on like Brechtian theater and on like breaking the fourth wall and engaging the audience in a abstract way and forcing them to ruminate and think while actively watching a film or at that time a play. And then De Palma, when he makes his first few movies, he's more inspired by Brecht. He's more inspired by Godard. He's making these experimental movies that are very much like, we're watching a movie, we're talking right into the lens. This is like, we are aware that you are aware. And as it goes on and as he's trying to kind of make a living, that starts to go away on a surface level, but it doesn't go away underneath. And in this, and this is 1981, there's no real internet, there's nothing like that to really clue you into how's a movie made? How, like this movie that I'm watching, like how did this happen? Like you just kind of assume like, oh, it just magicked itself together. there's not as much awareness as to how it's put together. And what De Palma does is he shows you how the sausage is made. He's showing you, here's how I put sound and image together. Here's how I cut it together. And he has to essentially animate these frames together to create moving image. And we show a painstaking process of how does he do that? He's cutting it out of a book. He's putting it all together. It's just bit by bit by bit by bit. Then we go through an exhausting sequence of him syncing the sound. And obviously the audience will watch it and start to realize, like, this is how this was made.
Yeah.
And then you start to think, oh, it's a succession of images and sound manipulated together.
Yeah.
And even though what he's doing is putting together a document of the truth, there's still that level of manipulation. You had to make it. You had to make it in a lab,
Right.
as he says. And then once you do that, you introduce this element of distrust.
Yeah.
Now you can't trust the image.
Right.
Why can't you trust the image? It's manipulated.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is happening here?
Yeah.
And now the audience is fully engaged in thinking about that.
Sure.
And you are now kind of removed from it all, and you're realizing De Palma's been manipulating you the whole time.
Yeah.
And he's cluing you in to how media manipulates you.
Yeah.
And it's just such a daring thing that a lot of people tend to tiptoe around. Like, no, just passive entertainment. Like, just like a normal film wouldn't have done those scenes. They might have done it, but it wouldn't have been as painstaking. It would have kind of tried to hide the magic trick, so to speak.
Yeah, so he's showing us the mechanics of cinema, like firsthand in his own film, right?
Yeah.
So there's it's very meta in a way, right?
For sure.
And I find I'm so intrigued by this process that Jack is doing throughout the film, where every time he's revisiting, his cutting room and he's marrying some kind of image, or there's a scene where he references that he's made a copy of the tape, right?
Yes.
And he hides the copy of the tape. And I just, I'm thinking about you as a filmmaker now in 2025 and how the process has changed so much, but we're watching a movie from 1981 and we're referencing this sort of audio-visual the techniques of movie making, and I love these like extreme close-ups of Jack's hands, and I think about where he's sort of like turning the dial to get the audio tape to roll, and then he hears something, so he stops it and he rewinds it, and you just sort of hear these sounds of the tape rewinding and fast forwarding, and then he's marrying audio and visual together, and I just find this to be such a tactile and interesting process that seems extinct and it doesn't exist as much anymore. And I'm just kind of curious about that as you're a filmmaker too. And before you get to that, I just wanted to add something I didn't realize until last night is, yes, Jack is uncovering the conspiracy, but what De Palma is doing is he's having the viewer uncover the conspiracy with Jack. It feels like you're an active participant of this. But I'm kind of curious to get your take on the sequences of Jack editing in the studio and playing with his gear. And, what do you think of this? What do you make of this?
It's, as a filmmaker, I will say, even though everything is now digital, technically easier, it's still a grind.
Sure.
Like, just him trying to sync the splash and the shot, and it goes on for forever, and he has to go back like a few frames to be like, is it on? Is it on? Is it on? You still have to do that. You still have to watch it a million times to be like, is it on the right frame? You're still dealing with frames.
Right.
Film is still photography.
Sure.
Even if it's digital, it's still 24 frames per second. You still have to deal with that. And you just don't have to use your hands as much. It went from full hand to just a finger. Like tap, 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 rather than just winding a finger.
Yeah. I'm so interested by these scenes where he's working on this production, and he's playing with all his gear, and we just see like celluloid film kind of hanging and drying. I just think that that's really interesting. I was wondering if you wanted to touch on, I was thinking as I was watching last night, we talked a little bit about this idea of De Palma's use of red, white, and blue throughout the film. And so we see different scenes where he's doing this. But I wanted to go back to the Jeep crashing into. I just think that that's such a great scene that I actually didn't catch the first time I saw the film. It took another viewing for me to really dial in what he was doing. So do you want to talk about the storefront and Jack? He's driving his Jeep. He's going to save Sally towards the end of the film, and he crashes into this storefront. Well,
fun fact about the just the Mummers Day Parade and the Liberty Day Parade in general. There's a bit of a serious situation in that film. They had to shoot the entire parade sequence twice.
Really?
Because someone stole the film.
Really?
So they shot it all with Vilmos Zsigmond. They shot it all. And what ended up happening was someone robbed one of the film trucks. And that's like they stole film canisters. That's one of the sequences that got stolen. Like the whole sequence, like from the car crash to everything, gone. No ransom note, nothing. It was just gone.
Oh, wow.
And to like this day, they're like, we don't know what happened. So they ended up, apparently everyone kind of rallied around the film to be like, well, we're going to show up and we're going to help you reshoot the whole sequence.
Wow.
Like the whole sequence.
Wow.
And Vilmos Zsigmond, the cinematographer, wasn't able to come back. I'm trying to remember who it was. It was another like big time cinematographer. Just decided like, I'm gonna help you guys out. So they redid the whole thing. It's just kind of interesting to be like, was it any different? But knowing De Palma, who storyboards every single frame, probably was just the same exact thing, maybe slightly different lighting depending on the time of day.
Right.
And the interesting thing about that sequence is it's kind of like a whole a chase through colonial American history. Like he's racing through the streets of Philadelphia. Right. There's like all of these big time landmarks that he's passing by. He's just screeching past, and you're like, oh, that's there. There's a giant statue of that political figure, and everything's red, white, and blue. Pretty much all of downtown Philadelphia seems to be like white stonework in that film.
Right.
And he's just charging straight through the parade. People are jumping out of the way. He has to swerve. He pivots. He goes right onto the sidewalk and into a storefront where we see a red coat mannequin hanging a rebel mannequin for being treasonous, for rebelling, for fighting against the system.
Right.
And Travolta just plows right into that and gets injured, stalling the chase sequence.
Right.
And it's just this incredible little moment of like, you didn't have to put that in there, but that's what's happening. You're fighting against the system.
Yeah.
And it's just like, no matter what, you've just replaced one awful repressive system with another.
Right.
And it just never seems to change.
Yeah.
And there's also an interesting thing, and I want to touch on this. There are a lot of 360 shots. There are a lot of shots that just keep revolving.
Yeah.
And they're always in situations where you would like to cut away. Jack's tapes are erased. We have that sequence where we just keep moving around the room. He keeps moving in and out of frame frantically as we're just experiencing his peripheral anxiety as all of his tapes are erased, and De Palma's not letting us out of the shot. And it just keeps going and going and going. Sally and Jack in the fireworks, spinning around them 360. The film itself is a loop because we start with a scream, we end with a scream.
Right.
No, we do not get let out of this.
But with the scream, it starts with a fake scream.
Yes.
But by the end of the film, it ends with a real scream.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's fake suffering leads to real suffering.
Yeah.
And it's just, there's no escaping the thing.
It feels like, we were just touching on the red coat and this sort of colonialist rebelling, right, in this lineage of American history and oppression by the government. I never noticed until last night how many shots have American flags in the background, right? I mean, specifically Sally's death, obviously, but that aerial shot where it's sort of following Jack through the parade. We see flags hanging from these government buildings. Also, just the use of the Jeep, right? Like the Jeep is seen as like a quintessential American vehicle.
Not only that, but it's an American military vehicle.
Right, yeah. So I think it's referencing that as well. I don't know. There's just little things that I hadn't quite noticed. And this is just, I think it goes to show De Palma's interest in the mechanics of cinema, right?
Yes.
And how thorough he is. Because if you break down every scene, there's just constantly things that he's referencing. Another thing I had mentioned earlier before we started recording was this idea about spectacle throughout the film and this idea of tragedy as construct. And, I think about Jack going to drop off the film at the lab, and there's this theater marquee right behind him, and there's these glowing lights, and it just reminds me of entertainment, right? And so we're constantly seeing newspapers, or the TV has some kind of news ad on.
Don't forget, there are a lot of posters and there are a lot of windows and screens in general in pretty much every frame.
Yeah.
Every frame has a window or a poster or a screen. It's just there's something to remind you of the artifice.
Yes.
Or just the fact that we are all under observation.
Yeah. And there's specifically, it's minor. People would miss it so easily, but there's a scene of Jack walking down the sidewalk, and almost everybody he passes is either wearing red, white, or blue. And it keeps going back to this idea, this kind of duality of like Americana in maybe a good way, but also this kind of Reagan era disillusionment going on, right? A return to greatness, yet at the same time, people are obviously not trusting the government as much, or losing faith in these institutions because of Chappaquiddick, or like you mentioned, JFK's assassination, Watergate, and Vietnam, right? So I think there's all these sort of interesting things, and it reminds me that De Palma is being incredibly cynical with this film, right? I saw part, like the background stuff, I saw it as sort of pro-American in a way, but I realized that this is actually part of De Palma's cynicism about the world, and specifically the world that we live in,
For
right?
sure.
And I just think that it's such a masterful way that he showed us. Yeah.
Well, for sure. And jumping back to the Redcoat.
Right.
It's execution and oppression.
Yes. Yes.
And it's against our fight against tyranny.
Right.
What's happening in the rest of the movie? What has the government been doing?
Oh, a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, and everyone is just so happy to walk the streets
Right.
wearing those pins and be
Right.
like, aren't we so proud?
Right. And everyone in
What
that's
do you
in the
have to be
background.
proud about?
Right. Outside of Burke and Jack and Sally, most people that are in the movie don't actually know what's going on,
No.
right? And so they're just sort of oblivious to the cover-up, the abuses of power. I just find all that to be incredibly interesting, the duality that De Palma is showing us, know, and how, I guess, once again, opaque or ambivalent people can be.
Like, I just think that if Jack were to succeed and get the film on the air, people aren't going to believe him, but he's probably going to end up with a book deal.
Right.
It's going to be commodified immediately.
Right.
There's no justice, but
Right.
there is money. There's profit. There's something that can be squeezed out of this.
Yeah.
And that's just the horrifying notion of none of this matters.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, to me, he loses Sally. He's not able to solve the conspiracy, but he does in a way. But he doesn't get the open praise that you're just referencing.
No. There's
in a way,
none of
right?
that. There's no book deal. There's
Right.
they don't get to go to Broadway.
Right.
You went up against a corrupt system that you can't succeed against.
Yeah.
You can't win against this thing. It's
Yeah.
so big. It's so monolithic. Even if they're also like this, these politicians, these corrupt guys are floundering. Like, they don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
Burke is just making it worse. It's just a bunch of fools too powerful to be stopped.
Right.
And it's just horrifying. Like, how do you deal with that?
Well, and I think that's ultimately the most disturbing part of this is that it is an assassination. There are many people throughout the film who die, right?
Yeah.
And Jack does uncover the truth, but
And no one will care.
right, and De Palma is sort of debunking that myth, right?
Yeah.
That once you find the truth, that justice will be
it
served.
gets on the news. It's just going to
Right.
become a story of the week. He'll get a book deal.
Right.
Going to be forgotten.
Right.
It doesn't matter because there's always the next bit of media.
Right.
There's the next controversy. It's going to do another thing. There's going to be another war.
Yeah.
doesn't matter.
Right. And that's the thing, is it doesn't matter because he uncovers the truth, and ultimately it changes nothing. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, I find that to be, wow.
Much more horrifying than...
Kyle, final thoughts. I mean, is there anything else that you'd like to add about Blowout that we didn't quite cover today? I know there's so much to say.
There are a lot of things to say. But like the more we say them, the more depressed I've been.
Yeah.
I
know.
It feels like you watch this and it gets timelier and timelier the more you watch. And I just want to go back to a very specific image that I feel like we should build upon.
Sure.
When Sally screams, she gives that scream. We get that big wide shot. What's behind her?
Oh, the flag?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A giant American flag.
Right.
What's happening around her? A big parade celebration. No one cares. It's just aren't we having a grand old time with this parade? Aren't we enjoying ourselves? And it feels like that is such an indictment of the system. It's like, that's Vietnam. That's Watergate. That's every single image rolled up into every single thing summed up in one perfect image.
Yeah.
Nancy Allen screaming in front of an American flag. No one's around to help her.
Yeah.
And it's the fault of our system. It's our fault.
Yeah.
Everyone's at fault.
Yeah. And Jack just in the distance, unable to help her. And he finally realizes where she's at. And he's just, once again, helpless.
Just a little too late.
Yeah.
Couldn't do it. I don't think he could have gotten there anyway. He did it he's responsible just as much as anyone else because he put Nancy Allen in the situation. And that's just the hardest pill to swallow in that movie.
Oof.
And it's an absolute punisher. It's an incredible movie, but I think that's another reason why De Palma doesn't get the credit he deserves. He's surrounded by Scorsese, Lucas, Coppola, Spielberg.
Yeah.
They're guys that can make powerful movies, but they don't really confront it as brutally as he does.
Yeah.
Like, he kind of stares into the void where they kind of will, like, will look into it. Spielberg has done some really heavy things. Scorsese, obviously, but they don't... You never leave their movies feeling ashamed.
Yeah.
You don't feel ashamed.
Yeah.
De Palma, you kind of have to look at yourself and realize... I'm just as responsible as they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's been a running thing throughout his filmography.
Yeah. It's one of those films that when the credits roll, I always sit there just sort of stunned at what I've just seen because it's incredible. Yet to me, it's De Palma's most tragic film. You know?
Well, Casualties of War is up there.
Sure.
They're in tandem, and I think they both kind of... I would never want to do it, but I think that would make a good double feature.
Yeah.
I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
But they're both very much coming from the same kind of anger, the same place, dealing with the same subject matter, except this time on Casualties, he removes the mask of filmmaking. It's like, this is a true story about Vietnam and about real things that we did.
Right.
That, like, you look at movies like Platoon or Full Metal Jacket. Platoon deals with it far more than Full Metal Jacket, which is more of a straightforward war film. But Platoon doesn't feel like a complete indictment of the system.
Yeah.
Casualties of War is like the system, the people, the government, you are all responsible.
Yeah. That's interesting that you mentioned that. There was one last question that I wanted to ask you about the lineage of political thrillers, because the 1970s, that was the decade of the political thriller, right? And Blowout is a film that came out in 81. So I'm thinking,
it's kind of at the tail end of it.
Yeah, it is the tail end. And we all know that when you move into a new decade, that the previous decade sort of spills over culturally, the aesthetics, the way people dress, the haircuts, things like that. And so it's an 80s film, but it feels more like a 70s
It's much closer to a 70s style.
I was curious, is there a particular political thriller that you think De Palma was maybe referencing or was interested in before he made Blowout? Because I have one that I sort of draw parallels to, but I wanted to get your answer.
There are two movies that are always specifically references for this one in particular. There's Antonioni's Blow Up.
Yes.
And there's Coppola's The Conversation.
Yes, yeah.
And he actually... because he knows Coppola. He knew Coppola. He spent time on the set with Coppola on the conversation. There's actually a really good interview. De Palma interviewed him for a magazine. You can find it on Google. It is really interesting because they both are talking about manipulation in media.
Interesting. Okay.
And I think those are the two very obvious points. I don't think he would have gotten a lot of traction out of something like 3 Days of the Condor.
Well, what about, I was actually initially, I see your point with the conversation, and I had drawn parallels to that too. And I knew about their friendship, and also the conversation was a Palme d'Or winner, right? So, I would imagine De Palma being a fan of film, he would have paid attention to what was going on at Cannes
Or he
that
was
year.
like, I mean, the movie's all right.
Right, yeah. But, to me, I was drawing parallels to the Parallax View with Warren Beatty. And it feels like, once again, it's this idea of like the lone hero up against this monolithic system.
Yeah, I feel like with the Parallax View, and I love Alan Pakula.
Yeah.
I love Alan Pakula.
Yeah,
Klute's great. All the President's Men, solid stuff.
Yeah.
Presumed Innocent, top tier courtroom thriller.
Sure.
But Parallax View is, I think, his best movie, hands down.
I think so too.
Klute keeps going up for me, though.
Yeah.
But Parallax, I think there's obviously a man against the system. And, like, it's not, like, nothing can be done to stop it in that movie. That movie is a horror film. And it's done like a horror film. But I think the difference lies in the fact that there's still an adherence to the sense that the government is in absolute control and that it is absolutely competent and will carry these things out in a way that's like they're competent in what they do. And that essentially means there's still faith in the system that it works. That's how I would view that.
Right.
De Palma does not have any faith in the system.
He's far more cynical.
Far more. And it's like, this is how it would actually go. Everyone's bumbling in the dark. You're just too rich, too powerful to be stopped. And the public is just too inundated with information and just too lazy to care.
Yeah.
And nothing's going to come out of that.
Sure.
Rather than, we're all great as people. We could solve this together if we just fight the system rather than you're part of it.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a great place to sort of wrap it up. Kyle, I want to thank you so much for being here today. This was an awesome conversation. And thanks again for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Reel One was recorded at Open Stage Media Studios, directed and edited by Zebschmidt, and produced by paulkazee.